So good evening, everyone. Welcome to this year's Bradlaugh Lecture. I'm Stephen Evans, the Chief Executive of the National Secular Society. Thanks for joining us on what will probably be quite a long night for the US election watchers amongst us. But at least for the time being, we can relax and focus on matters closer to home. Look, I'm sorry we can't do this in Manchester, which has fast become the spiritual home of the Bradlaugh Lecture, but I'm delighted that we can be with you this evening, wherever you are, for this, the first ever online Bradlaugh Lecture, which we're bringing to you in partnership with our friends at Conway Hall. Thanks to everyone who made donations to Conway Hall when making their booking. As I'm sure you'll appreciate, this is a very difficult time for event venues, and Conway Hall is one of the best. So your contributions are very welcome. Now, the lecture itself is named after the founder of the NSS, who you should be able to see behind me there, Charles Bradlaugh, who's got quite a story. Despite being elected as an MP to Parliament in 1880, he was effectively denied his seat for almost 6 years on account of his atheism. After finally making it into Parliament, he was instrumental in bringing about a change in the law to ensure that non-religious MPs could take their seats in Parliament by way of a non-religious affirmation rather than a religious oath by swearing their allegiance to God. Today, we continue Bradlaugh's work by campaigning for a secular state where everyone's human rights are respected and everyone's freedoms are balanced fairly, so no one is either disadvantaged or advantaged on account of their beliefs. And all of our work is made possible by our members. So if you do support what we do, please do become a member, which you can do online via the website. So tonight we are delighted and honoured to be joined by Geoffrey Robertson QC to discuss two important Enlightenment principles: free speech and the separation of church and state, which in the UK, of course, means disestablishment of the Church of England. So Geoffrey is a leading human rights barrister, an academic, author, and broadcaster. He's the founder and the head of Doughty Street Chambers, the UK's largest human rights practice. During his distinguished career as trial counsel, human rights advocate, and UN judge, Geoffrey has defended blasphemers such as the Gay News magazine in their famous court battle against Mary Whitehouse after they published the poem, "The Love That Dare Not Speak Its Name." Geoffrey has also represented Salman Rushdie in a blasphemy case brought against the Satanic Verses. And in 2010, he published The Case of the Pope, which argued that Pope Benedict was guilty of protecting paedophiles, that the Vatican isn't really a sovereign state, and that the Pope shouldn't be immune from prosecution. Quite right. So whether you consider yourself to be a disestablishmentarian or an anti-disestablishmentarian, I'm sure you'll find tonight's lecture well worth tuning in for. Okay, so Geoffrey will speak for around 50 minutes to an hour this evening, which will be followed by a short Q&A session. So if you'd like to ask any questions, please get your questions in by the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. We do need to finish by 8:30, but I'll be sure to get through as many questions as possible. So just to be clear, your videos are automatically turned off, so don't worry, we can't see you. We can't hear you either. So please do use the Q&A function if you'd like to ask any questions of Geoffrey, and use the chat function if you need to speak to a member of the team for any reason. So that's all from me now. So let's just pray the Wi-Fi works. And without further delay, I'll ask Geoffrey to make sure he's unmuted, which I think he is. And I'll hand you over to Geoffrey Robertson QC. Thank you.
Good evening. It's a real honor to deliver a lecture in commemoration of Charles Bradlaugh, who founded this society 150 years ago. He was a solicitor's clerk, well known to Charles Dickens, who immortalized that group of lesser lawyers, although Bradlaugh at a young age was quite precocious. He was a Sunday school teacher by the time he was 17, and he noticed some discrepancies between the Bible and the 39 Commandments. The vicar denounced him as an atheist and threw him out. His parents threw him out onto the streets, but he was picked up by the widow of Richard Carlile, that courageous publisher who went to prison for publishing Tom Paine's The Age of Reason. And he was introduced to George Holyoake, who saw his potential. These free thinkers, it's nice to think of them at a time when they were persecuted, at a time when they were put in prison for their religious non-beliefs, that they stuck together and helped each other. Well, Bradlaugh didn't need much help. He was a brilliant writer and editor, and he published a paper called The Reformer, which was very soon charged with blasphemy and sedition, as it should have been, but as the law was in those days. He was acquitted, unusually. Usually they were convicted, but he was acquitted. However, sex, when he moved on with Annie Besant to deal with birth control, that was too much initially for the Victorians. In 1877, he was convicted for writing a book with her called The Fruits of Philosophy, a private companion for young married couples. But they succeeded on appeal because the prosecution was so prurient that it refused to set out the obscene passages in the indictment. And on that technicality, the Court of Appeal released them from prison. Well, he entered Parliament in 1880, but he didn't. The electors of Northampton elected him, but he refused to take the oath. And there was a terrific kerfuffle in Parliament about whether he could be an MP by affirming and not taking the oath on the Bible. And this raged back and forth. There were committee after committee deciding, A, whether he could be an MP if he didn't swear on the Bible. And then when Bradlaugh said, all right, I'll take the oath, but he wrote to the Times a few days before saying, I'm only taking the oath because it's full of meaningless words. So my conscience isn't clogged by it. And so then there was another debate over whether he could take the oath without accepting that it had any meaning. So back and forth it went. He had Gladstone on his side, George Bernard Shaw, and so on. But for 6 years it took before he was allowed to become an MP by taking the meaningless oath. He was at one point arrested by the Sergeant at Arms and put in a small cell beneath Big Ben, the place for contemners of Parliament, the last person to occupy it. I think it's still there in his honor. But finally, when he became an MP in 1886, his great achievement was to initiate the Oaths Act of 1888. And that allowed agnostics and atheists to sit in Parliament on taking a solemn affirmation. But it did more than that. It allowed them to be witnesses in court. You weren't allowed to be a witness in court if you wouldn't take the oath on the Bible. And it allowed them to be jurors. Jurors could not sit unless they made a solemn statement on the Bible. So we remember him today. When I did jury trials, it was heartwarming to find those who were prepared to wave away the Bible that the usher would proffer them and take instead the card which allowed them to make a solemn affirmation. One's heart leapt because it was always felt, or I felt, that a juror who was doubtful about the existence of God might doubt the veracity of the police evidence. So it was an important thing that is still remembered in the courts. But so the flame still burns, and it was a tragedy that he died in 1891, just 5 years after his entry to Parliament. His funeral was attended by 3,000 people, including the young Gandhi. Of course, the church put round a rumor that he'd had a deathbed conversion, but his daughter published a detailed refutation of that. Well, let me begin by making a confession. I am a communicant member of the Church of England. I haven't yet, to my knowledge, been discommunicated, but I took the, I suppose it was an oath, to become a member. I had the Archbishop's hands laid upon me at the age of 16. This was a better age than my Jewish friends, of course, who had been bar mitzvahed at 13, and certainly a better age than my Roman Catholic friends, who went to communion and confession from the age of 7, being brainwashed into believing that the priests who so often abused them, as a Royal Commission has recently found, were the agents of God, and so had that perverse power over them. But I, like Bradlaugh, had done well at Sunday school in the suburbs of Sydney. At the time, I was considered ready for confirmation, and the Anglican Archbishop of Sydney, Archbishop Goff, a rather upper-class Englishman, was to officiate. He was famous at the time because he had built a rapport with the young editor of the local tabloid, one Rupert Murdoch, aged about 24, I think. And he would always have the front page headlines. The younger generation is wallowing in a mire of sexual immorality, he said, just before my conversion. I wasn't doing much, or indeed any wallowing, but the Archbishop certainly was. Throughout the range of his archbishopric, he was being cited in secret divorce petitions. And of course, this was hushed up. The Establishment Church could not bear the embarrassment. Even young Rupert was powerless to print the whole sordid story. It was whispered in the Catholic confessionals, which was the way stories got around in those censorious times. But the promiscuous primate was sent back to England, to the smallest parish in the country, as his punishment. So there was, I suppose, my first experience of the church's problem with sex. This is something, I suppose, may not be surprising, given the way in which it was first established. Now, if you want to disestablish a national institution, it seems to me only fair to look at the way it was established in the first place, because obviously that should be a matter of national pride, a result of some moral or intellectual movement that should be specially remembered 500 years later. Something in our history that we can cherish and applaud. Well, let's face it, the Church of England was established because of the lust of a pathological monster. That was how Henry VIII was described in the Times last week, as the evidence came to light of how he had planned to the last detail the grisly death of Anne Boleyn. The church and pro-church historians would have us believe that he was motivated by a desire to leave a son to rule England. Problem with that, firstly, is that it endorses the view that women were so inferior they weren't up to snuff as rulers, but he already had a perfectly good son by Bessie Blount, who was lady's maid to Queen Catherine. He looked like Henry and was called the Duke of Richmond and was being groomed to take the throne if Henry failed to have a male heir. But Henry, as we know, fell in love with Anne. And as every schoolboy knows who's read his love letters, he wanted to slobber all over her little duckies. And in other words, to have sex with her. And no doubt Anne did play him along for several years while Wolsey tried to obtain the Pope's support for a divorce on the grounds that he'd married his deceased brother's wife and hadn't noticed it for 17 years. But he was becoming desperate, and doubtless held off, I think, until late, probably December 1532. He married her secretly in January 1533, and the baby was due in September. So it was Thomas Cromwell who engineered the establishment of the Church of England by an act of Parliament called, uninspiringly, an Act in Restraint of Appeals. That's the Church of England's beginning, an Act in Restraint of Appeals. In other words, it abolished the Pope as the final appeal court for English ecclesiastical matters, including divorce. Now, okay, there was a bit of Brexiteering about this act by Cromwell. He played on nationalist sympathies, asserting in the statute that this realm of England is an empire, an independent sovereign state, independent of the Pope, and that the king is supreme head of both the church and the state. That's where it all comes from, an act in restraint of appeals. Well, a few weeks later, in May, Cranmer dissolved his marriage with Catherine. 5 days later, the secret marriage with Anne was announced, and she was crowned as queen. For those 6 months, of course, he'd been living bigamously with 2 wives. But when the news reached Rome, the Pope, of course, excommunicated him, and the Church of England was born. As Roger Scruton says, honestly, I quote, much of it following the curious logic of Henry's hormones. It's interesting, certainly, and enjoyable in a way as we sit back in lockdown to watch repeats of Wolf Hall, but it's not particularly inspiring. The events are not such as to induce very much national pride. Church, of course, could have told it differently as a wonderful feminist fable. Behold, a country where women are inferior, where women are viewed as not fit to rule. And then Anne contrives with her erotic skill to win Henry's heart and his codpiece, and to induce the breach with Rome. And then he has her murdered by Cromwell, false evidence, and the agency of what's called a kangaroo court, although As an Australian, I can't bear that term. I don't know what our beloved marsupial has done to become a symbol of injustice. But there's no evidence. I think it's quite plain that this was a frame-up, that Cromwell, there was only one person who confessed, the pop idol of the court, a young musician who was severely tortured by Cromwell to get that confession. But the story ends happily, doesn't it? As the feminist fable could be told, when the girl baby that Anne had cradled moments before she went to execution became, at the age of 25, the queen who re-established the church, which had been bloodied for a while by Mary, re-established the Church of England in such a way at her settlement everyone had to attend, which is certainly not the case today, where so few do. Less than 2% of the British public go to the Church of England with any regularity. You could tell the story that way, or you could tell it by reference to the Cambridge apostles, not Philby and Blunt. 400 years earlier, there was a group who studied Luther secretly at Cambridge, Cranmer and Latimer and Ridley and others, and they laid the intellectual foundation, opposition to indulgences and the illogicalities of Catholicism. But their success, came in the end because of this monster king's desire to have sex with the woman he loved. There it is. Well, one of the consequences of having a state church is that attacks upon it are regarded as attacks on the state, a form of sedition. That was decided by Lord Chief Justice Hale in 1677, convicting a man who said religion is a cheat. To say that religion is a cheat, said Lord Chief Justice Hale, is to dissolve all those obligations whereby civil society is preserved. Christianity is part of the law of England, and therefore to reproach the Christian religion is to speak in subversion of the law. Well, it wasn't, of course, but this doctrine held sway for centuries, and particularly in the years after the French Revolution, there was a rash of blasphemy prosecutions and judges jailed booksellers and publishers, especially for publishing the works of Tom Paine, The Rights of Man and The Age of Reason, courageous men like Richard Carlile. And as late as 1840, a book that attacked the Old Testament's violence saw its author imprisoned because, I quote the judge, he was careless of the effect it might have on the unthinking working class. They're like the law of obscenity, the law of blasphemy, there to protect the unthinking working class from thinking thoughts that the establishment didn't want them to think. And I think the change, this rash of blasphemy prosecutions only really stopped in 1851, when the law officers wrote a note saying that lectures given by John Stuart Mill, expressing mildly agnostic ideas, were technically blasphemy, but it wouldn't be in the public interest to prosecute him. So, since it was a judge-made law, the judges changed it a little. In the case of Ramsay and Foote in 1883, they ruled that a mere denial of Christianity was not enough to constitute the offence of blasphemy. This was important for Bradlaugh's battle at the time to be an MP and not take the oath. But it said, if the decencies of controversy are observed. That was not the case with other religions. You could be as rude as you like about Methodists and Catholics, but it was, the judges said, a person may, without being liable to prosecution for it, attack Judaism or Mohammedanism or even any sect of the Christian religion, save the established religion of the country. So there you had the blasphemy law protecting the Anglican Church. No one could poke fun at the Anglican Church. If they did, then like the appropriately named Mr. Gott in 1922, he was jailed for publishing a little booklet called Rib Ticklers for Parsons, one of which said that Jesus entered Jerusalem like a circus clown on the back of 2 donkeys. That earned him 18 months in prison. He was the last person to be put in prison in Britain for blasphemy. And by 1977, the kind of crime was thought to be a dead letter. But that was when Mary Whitehouse, fancying herself as moral protector of the realm, and her counsel, a red-faced, tub-thumping, gay-bashing barrister called John Smythe, pounced upon a poem in Gay News, which, horribile dictu, suggested that Christ's love for humankind had extended to a gay centurion and had been consummated when he was on the cross. Mary was given to describing herself as just a Colchester housewife, but she was in fact a front for the very well-funded moral rearmament movement determined to stamp out the beginnings of gay liberation. Her argument, John Smythe's argument, was simple. Christianity is part of the law of England. The established church held that homosexuality was a sin. But the church fundamental doctrine was that Christ was without sin. Therefore, attributing to him any attraction to a gay centurion was blasphemy, punishable by imprisonment for life. Smythe described the metaphors of the poet, the fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, as, I quote, so vile it would be hard for the most perverted imagination to conjure up anything worse. I think it was Mark Twain who noted this phenomenon, to the pure, all things are impure. Just how pure Smythe was, he was a devotee of what he called masculine Christianity. We'll see in a little while. Well, they impaneled a jury. John Morton and I were defending. We were glumly noticed that none of them took their oath on as an affirmation. They all took it on the Bible. Where was Bradlaugh when he was needed? Our first submission was that Christianity was not part of the law, but the judge ruled that because the Anglican Church was established, that meant it was. He was the president of a synagogue and thought for some reason that it would make him famous to be the first Jewish judge in history to preside over a conviction for Christian blasphemy. And he said so in his autobiography. admitting his total bias, but adding that he was not alone in securing the conviction. When writing his summing up, he said, "I was conscious of an unseen superhuman hand guiding my pen." I have to say that if God did write the summing up, it would have been fairer to the defense. It was a direction to convict. He told the jury that since they'd all taken their oaths on the New Testament, they might feel obliged to convict. He allowed Mary's followers to gather in the corridors of the court, praying for a conviction, and refused to allow the defendant to give, the editor of Gay News, to give evidence as a witness in his own defense. That's how ridiculous the trial was. And that was the appeal point on which we should have won. And I'll never forget standing in the corridor with John Mortimer. You wait in the corridor until the decrepit old law lords shuffle past and into the House of Lords chamber where they sat in those days as the Supreme Court of the land. And at about 10:27, they came in at 10:30, the television monitors all crackled into life. And we had to listen to prayers, parliamentary prayers, said every morning by a bishop of the Anglican Church on this day to help these elderly law lords to convict a blasphemer. Well, there were 5 of them, and 2 of them were very good, brilliant lawyers, Lord Diplock and Lord Edmund Davies. I'm sure they hated the poem, but they were rigid in their application of the law. The other 2, one was a Catholic who refused even to read it, so biased was he, and the other was Reggie Dillon, Lord Dillon, Reginald Bullying Manor, as he was known when he was Macmillan's Attorney General, who advised to prosecute Lady Chatterley's lover. So it was 2-2, and great surprise, we lost Leslie Scarman, who was a great judge and true liberal, but he was exercised very much at the time by racism in society, and he was anxious to have all races protected. And he realized, and he was right, that attacks on Islam would soon become just another form of racial hatred. So he said that blasphemy should be a strict liability offense, covering insults to all religions. This was a mistake, of course, historically, and it left the law very unclear. I made quite a good living out of advising as an expert on blasphemy. I was hired by the British Board of Film Censors for an opinion on whether the life of Brian was blasphemous and they should stop it. I said it wasn't, because of course Brian was not the Messiah, he was a very naughty boy. And then I was retained to advise on the Hollywood movie The Last Temptation of Christ, after the Gay News trial judge, a dreadful fellow called King Hamilton, had written to the Times. He hadn't seen the film, of course, but he demanded that it be prosecuted because he'd heard that it was scurrilous. I saw it, I didn't find it. I found the only scurrilous thing about it was that Christ and his disciples were all played by Americans, while Judas and the devil and all the baddies spoke with English accents. But the end of blasphemy came as a result of the Ayatollah Khomeini, who pronounced in 1988 a fatwa on Salman Rushdie for writing the satanic verses. Salman had to go into hiding, and a group of Muslim barristers had the bright idea of trying to flush him out by serving a summons for both blasphemy and sedition. They relied on Lord Scarman's unwise words about blasphemy being able to extend to all religions. Magistrate threw the case out on the basis you could only blaspheme against the Anglican Church. So they took their forensic jihad to the High Court. And of course, there was a lot of publicity. And I got a call from Scotland Yard just before the case and they said, we've identified you as a potential terrorist target, grade 3. And apparently the fear was that Islamic fundamentalists, failing to discover where Salman was hiding, would choose his barrister as a sufficient substitute. So they said, we're going to come round and show you how to detect a bomb under your car. We thought they'd come round with some James Bond-like electronic device. They came around with a broom and a mirror and showed us how to tie the mirror to the broom and look under the car. My wife wailed, but it all looks like a bomb under there. But in any event, we got by with a few death threats, badly written by hand and sent to the court. It's now these threats come by email or on social media, but in those days they were not communicated readily. But the court, and it was a top divisional court, ruled that blasphemy only covered the Anglican Church and that it shouldn't be prosecuted unless it incited violence. The government accepted this view. It said it's damaging and divisive legislation. And in due course, years later, when hardly anyone noticed, blasphemy was abolished. It's plucked from view. But whatever happened to John Smythe? After Gay News, he's offered his services, evangelical services, to a famous Anglican boys' school near his country home. He would select most attractive of the 14 and 15-year-olds and take them to his potting shed. There he'd explain that God wanted them punished for masturbating. He would take their trousers down and beat them until the buttocks bled, causing extreme pain and long-term psychological damage. The headmaster was told all about this. You know what he did? He called Smythe up and said, I won't go to the police if you leave the country. So Smythe did, causing other allegations against him to be made in South Africa and Zimbabwe. The scandal was exposed by Channel 4 about 10 years ago, and police investigated and brought charges, but sadly, Smythe died before he could be arrested. The church's report, which has been long delayed, is due next year, and I'm told it will identify some very prominent clergy who knew about his abuse back in the 1980s, but like the headmaster, did nothing about it. And only a fortnight ago, of course, we have the independent inquiry into child abuse, which found our national church was guilty of covering up child abuse in order to protect its reputation and its finances. These bishops, they are bishops, are given a privileged place in our legislature. 26 privileged places as Lords spiritual, with the Lords temporal crowding in the House of Lords. And so would we miss them if the church was disestablished? I don't think so. We haven't missed the blasphemy law, and we wouldn't miss the 26 privileged places in a disestablished church. The church has been disestablished in Wales back in 1920. The Church of Scotland isn't really established because it doesn't want any links with government, quite rightly. So the Church of England is unique. All religions in clinging to these links with the state. What does it mean? Well, for a start, it accepts a monarch as its head of the church as well as head of the state. She's legally dubbed Defender of the Faith and Supreme Governor of the Church of England. They come together. And any changes to the Book of Common Prayer must be not only passed by the General Synod, which is right, but formally approved by both houses of Parliament. You don't change your prayers unless Parliament approves. This is not just giving Caesar his due, but allowing Caesar to walk all over you, should he choose. And what church with any integrity would allow that to be run by the state and allow its bishops and archbishops to be appointed by the Prime Minister? Church of England is really in the hands of the state. Not that the state bothers very much to interfere. Mrs. Thatcher did a few times on choices of bishops, but they're a pretty subservient lot these days. And although I must say that Rowan Williams, who is a considerable mind, alone with the bishops, has said disestablishment would give the church a certain integrity. How right he is, and how the church lacks integrity by its truckling to state control, even if that control is rarely used. It's humiliating, and should be humiliating, to a church with the integrity that comes from independence. So I think disestablishment is a good thing for the church. Then, of course, there's the phenomenon that John Mortman and I encountered when waiting to argue the Gay News blasphemy case, the daily prayers from the Book of Common Prayer in the Bible, said by bishops every day on a daily rota. Why is it thought that a reading from the Apostle will inspire MPs to argue about Brexit? Not only is it a waste of parliamentary time and a snub to those with no Anglican faith, or no faith at all, and it's incompatible with the democratic ideal of separation of church and state, but it's bloody annoying, because for an MP to reserve a seat at Prime Minister's question time, he or she has to put down a green card indicating that they'll attend prayers at the start of the day. It's the same system as German tourists use when they leave their towels to reserve the best chairs by the pool. But it forces MPs to listen to prayers if they want to ask questions of the Prime Minister. And I'm very glad to read that it's been challenged by an associate of this society, Crispin Blunt, who has the support of the speaker that no one should be forced to listen to prayers as the price of asking a question to the Prime Minister. And MPs are representatives of a nation where 52% of the public on the latest survey say they have no religion, and where just 12% of those who have religion say they're affiliated to the Church of England. So it's absurd to think that MPs will be inspired by prayers from a church in which so few of their constituents worship. And even more absurd is the notion that we should be the only country in the world, apart from Iran, to have theocrats sitting as of right in our legislature. The bishop's bench is an anomaly and an anachronism. There are 26 of them. Its defenders say it's there to promote morality in Parliament, although that's an argument that's difficult to sustain. In the recent years, the bishop's bloc, as I would call it, has rejected a number of legislative initiatives, mostly to do with cutting down on church privileges. They're wholly unrepresentative, even of their own flock, being mainly male and white and middle class, and far from promoting morality. They've been hostile to women's rights. The first, they held out against women bishops until 2015. They've been unanimously opposing same-sex marriage and the decriminalization of assisted suicide. So it's no answer, though too often it's the answer that is given, that we should create places for leaders of other religions, far less progressive even than our own bishops. I don't want to get into the vexed question of House of Lords reform, but surely its members should be elected, appointed on their own merits, rather than as placemen of an official church. So let me now turn to perhaps the most important aspect, looming aspect of the establishment of the church. Nowhere will it be more apparent and seem more jarring and antediluvian than at the coronation of Charles III. Now, I must be careful here. The 1381 Treason Act makes it a crime, carrying life imprisonment, to imagine the death of the monarch. But just suppose in 2023, the Queen decides, after 70 years of loyal and faithful service, to do a Pope Benedict and retire. There's nothing to stop her. She may, of course, do a Rupert Murdoch and decide to remain as head of her empire, but retirement she deserves, and then we would have to crown Prince Charles. There'd be lots of consequences, the least of which would be my own overnight transformation into a KC, King's Council. I'd have to pay a lot of money, I imagine, for some new letters patent. But the coronation ceremony, and I'm old enough to remember quite vividly the last one in 1953, small child drinking in the pageantry There'll be, the pageantry will come back. They'll dust off the golden coach, the plush red seats, the exotic footmen and footwomen, I imagine this time, the bejeweled crowns and orbs, and the impedimenta of royalty. But it will be a Church of England show, a restatement of the divine right of kings, that which Charles I was taken to the block for. A new king, chosen by his Hanoverian genes, will be anointed and crowned in a religious ceremony in which he will take the coronation oath. He will swear to preserve the laws of God, the Anglican religion, the doctrine of the Church, and the rights and privileges of its clergy. It is quite extraordinary, isn't it? Instead of swearing to uphold the Constitution and the rights of Parliament and of the people and the guidance of the judiciary, this king comes forth as bound only by the unknowable laws of God and a full-blooded devotion to the doctrines and teachings of the Church of England. What message does this send? This ceremony meant to unite the nation, which in fact only refers to a small part of it, and excludes those who are members of other churches, and the majority of the people who are members of no church at all. Well, Prince Charles, to do him justice, has said he wants to be crowned as defender of faith rather than defender of the Church of England. And that's an improvement, but not by much. What about defending those of no faith? The majority. What about a tribute to those who've done most for parliamentary democracy? The English dissenters, the Puritans, the regicide, who envisaged the most important principles of modern democracy, including the separation of church and state. That may be too much to hope for, but in any view, there must be a careful and open consultation about the coronation, the role of the church, other than providing a picturesque backdrop in Westminster Abbey for a ceremony that will otherwise send a message of discrimination and privilege, and above all, of silliness. Swearings in should be taken seriously. And much as I shared with Charles a youthful love of the goon show, I do think that a change of monarch should be ushered in with some dignity and logic. But here I go, trying to make monarchy more acceptable by disestablishing the church. I should perhaps be thinking of making the church more acceptable by disestablishing the monarchy. That was the great fear, you remember, of James I, when he explained to his son, Charles Stuart, why he was crushing the Puritans who were demanding a disestablishment of the bishops. It's very simple, son, he said, no bishop, no king. So let's remember in this commemoration of Charles Bradlaugh that he was a fervent and important Republican, with his lectures on impeachment of the House of Brunswick, courageously raising his voice against the extravagance, incompetence, and corruption of those, quote, costly puppets, useful only to the governing aristocracy as a cloak to shield their real wrongdoers, by which he meant the monopolists of land, industry, and power in the Victorian age. Socialism, however, was a bridge too far. He marched with the poor match girls in Victorian London, but his love of liberty made him cautious about boosting the power of the state. He just wanted it stripped of its illogical excrescences, beginning with the established church and the established monarchy. Well, I began by recalling the hypocritical hands laid on me by the Archbishop all those years ago, and I interpreted the establishment of the Anglican Church as a consequence of the sex drive of a pathological monster, and I maintained in passing the problems with Mr. Smythe and the latest damning report on the bishop's failure to safeguard their flock from the sexual appetites of those placed in spiritual power over them. Has the Church of England learned anything? It may be the most tolerant of religions, but is that saying very much? Their latest pastoral statement on civil partnerships a year ago says, I quote, that sex outside marriage falls short of God's purposes for human beings. They still don't get it. An insult not only to the LGBT community, but to most heterosexuals as well. No wonder that in 2019, fewer than 2% worship at their churches. And as Roger Scruton said, sadly, died, but nonetheless, for most people now resident in England, the church is simply the empty Gothic building at the end of the road, visited for the first time, if at all, when dead. But really, the Church of England can be better than this. And disestablishment may give it the independence to redress and reconsider and discover its true vocation. A guardian of 13,000 churches, 43 cathedrals, places that should be open to all who need a place of sanctuary, a place to think, to recover, to sort their minds out at a time when COVID-19 has turned their lives upside down. I could scarcely believe it when the Church of England rushed to lock up its churches in the first wave of lockdown. Quote, ink monitors to the establishment, said the Daily Mail, right for once. This is a time we need what the church can best provide, an opportunity for solace, some sanity beneath the steeple. So I'm not hostile to the church, its sanctions, its sanctuaries, its inspirations from Gray's Elegy in a Country Churchyard to Eliot's Four Quartets, reminding us that while the light fails on a winter's afternoon in a secluded chapel, history is now and England. And that history, true history, will not be present in an antique pageant, the coronation, that celebrates the follies of heredity and pomp and aristocracy. Secularists, I suppose, can cudgel their brains, thinking of how religions may repay the massive subsidies they receive from their tax-free charitable status. I've often thought, driving across England, dotted with marks of church spires, what a good idea it would be if to require churches to provide 24-hour public toilets beneath the steeple so we'd know where to go when caught short. But I have a better, bigger idea, inspired by the history I've been looking up, the established church. It's an idea for Rishi Sunak, faced like Henry VIII with a calamitous deficit. He should think of Cromwell, not Oliver, but Thomas, for whom the establishment of the Church of England provided the solution to the national debt. He dissolved the monasteries, and the government should pay for COVID by dissolving the tax breaks of the church. Indeed, of all churches, including, would you believe, the Church of Scientology and Moonies, which all receive them, the Church of England has an endowment of 9 billion, and they have the best financial advisors in the land who get them 10%. So they have $1 billion a year tax-free from their investments alone, along with hundreds of millions each year from donations, hundreds of millions from the government for their schools, even 42 million from the government, from us, from the taxpayer, to replace the lead on their roofs and to keep their steeples standing. So the great wealth of the church awaits another chancellor in his hour of need. If the church is to be part of the state, and it is, its funds should be available to the state for use, public benefit. That's just another reason why the church itself should welcome disestablishment, so it can cherish its independence, keep after paying tax on its money, and speak truth to power without being part of that power. I don't think it will happen soon. We are the most apathetic of countries where our constitution is concerned. We don't even have a written one. We haven't got round to writing it down. The UK and Saudi Arabia are the only countries in the world without written constitution. We both have crown princes, at least ours is not a murderer. But I salute the NSS for keeping alive the memory of that courageous free thinker, Charles Bradlaugh, who made life easier for all of us. And although I may despair at early reform, I offer the stoic consolation expressed by an early freethinker, John Lilburne, the Leveller, who said, "Our cause and principles do through their own natural truth and lustre get ground in men's understandings, so that though we fail, our truths prosper, and posterity, we doubt not, shall reap the benefit of our endeavors." So thank you for listening to me. I'm tempted to end tonight by saying, God save America. But if Trump is re-elected, that, I think, would be the ultimate blasphemy. Thank you.
Thank you, Geoffrey. Right, thanks very much for that engaging and very colourful journey through religious privilege and establishment, which, as you say, began with the lust of a pathological monster, which is a line that I won't forget in a long time. Thanks also for risking a breach of the Treason Act of 1381 on our behalf. Thank you very much for that. Right, it's 8:30. I did promise we would finish at 8:30, and we're right on the dot. So, Geoffrey, just remains for me to say a big thank you to you for giving up your time. There's lots of other questions we haven't been able to answer, but there's lots of comments as well saying how much people enjoyed it. So thank you ever so much. We really appreciate it. And a big thank you to all of you for tuning in. And remember, if you do support the work of the National Secular Society, please do, if you're not already a member, nail your colours to the mast and do join us, and we will put your principles into action. So I hope you've enjoyed the lecture. That's all from us. Good night and thank you.
Thank you.